Unite the Right. Heather Hare. James Alex Fields.
The Weston. I'm sorry, speak into the mic, you can barely hear you.
James Alex Fields, Heather Hare, Unite the Right, Charlottesville, and let's not forget General Robert E. Lee. These are some of the places, slogans, names, and symbols that have occasioned the panel today in observation of Constitution Day to discuss their meaning and the Jim Crow Monuments controversy, the title of this panel. So I think some people may ask why a panel like this is a symbol for Constitution Day, right? Why should public universities and their faculty comment on this matter, despite that many of the campuses on which they work feature the very statues and or names that helped stoke the controversy in the first place. What does this conversation have to do with the U.S. Constitution? Despite that the monuments that we will be discussing represent people touted for rebelling against that very Constitution or defending it, depending on your perspective. So we assembled this panel today to draw these questions and a little more out together at this present historical and political moment that requires, I think, some critical thought on the part of scholars. So I am your moderator, Weston Haywood. I'll now allow the panelists to introduce themselves, after which we will launch into a conversation with a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor up for questions from the audience. So.
Yeah, oh, and first thing, Joyce, do you mind turning the lamp off? The switch is right there at the panel, control panel, behind the microphone. It says lamp off. It should be on the left side there. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, and let me also say that if you are here as a student for one of the classes, there are sign-in sheets in the back. There's also one for a separate course, the city course. So be mindful of where you're signing so that you are recorded as having attended.
So I'm Rick Swanson, Department Head of Political Science. I've been here since 2001. And I'm now an honorary Cajun since I married a Cajun woman. and my in-laws are sitting right there. So.
My name is Maria Seeger. I'm an assistant professor in the English department here, and my work focuses mostly on 19th century American literature and African American literature.
I'm Ian Beamish. I'm an assistant professor in the history department, and I study 19th century U.S. history and the history of slavery.
All right, so just to kick everything off, if you guys can let us know what are the origins of these monuments, sort of where do they all come from?
Well, I think a good place to start is exactly with this context. And I think the important thing for us to remember is that as much as these monuments are often labeled Confederate monuments, I think it's more appropriate to have what we have today, the title of Jim Crow monuments, to properly understand the context. So there's something in the order of 1,500 public symbols, monuments to the Confederacy around the nation, most but not all in the southern states. And about 700 of those take the form of statues. And about 37 of those are here in the state of Louisiana. And across the country, the majority of these monuments and public symbols were constructed not in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but significantly later, at two moments when white supremacy was in peril. In the 1890s through the 1920s, as Jim Crow laws and increased legal segregation of the South was happening, and a second moment in the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights era, as there were new sets of challenges to the racial hierarchy. And these monuments were erected mostly in the South, but were in many ways a national project. They were mass-produced mostly by factories in the North because they were so common, and shipped down here. They were often erected in very public demonstrations, ceremonies. One monument, the closest to us here in Lafayette, erected in 1922, was attended not just by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who funded it and donated it to the city. You said it was, I don't know if I have the exact phrase here, but yeah, it was erected to perpetuate the very best that has been achieved by our great and truly noble Southern race. And everybody in this crowd would have been pretty aware what Southern race meant in 1922. And this was attended by R.L. Mouton, the mayor at the time, by the governor of Louisiana, and by the Catholic bishop of Lafayette. So these were not small affairs. Most of the businesses in the city closed down to erect the monument. So I think it's important for us to recognize the context of these monuments are in Jim Crow, in the civil rights era, and as sort of monuments quite clearly to white supremacy more than to the Confederacy itself.
Yeah, I think the main conceit of DeWeston's excellent question is that monuments oftentimes say more about the period in which they were erected than the period that they're trying to remember. And so I think it's super important to keep in mind the historical origins that Ian just gave us the details of. Yeah,
in fact, just to dovetail on what both Ian and, again, I've just met Maria for the first time, by the way, so I hope to work with her in the future and Ian on some scholarship since our interests overlap. The Alexander Mouton statue in particular, and this was 1922, and this is when lynchings are peaking through all around the South. Jim Crow is in full force. As Ian said, the speaker talked about our noble Southern race, and they didn't mean black folk in that speech that they were talking about. And the governor, when he attended, he came to Lafayette to visit, and within a couple days, he stayed for a few days, and he gave a talk to a local organization. This was reported in what was then called the Lafayette Advertiser, the precursor to the Daily Advertiser. And he boasted about his father and grandfather had been members of the KKK, and he was very proud of that fact. But now he was against the KKK only because they used violence. And the reason he thought that violence wasn't needed anymore is because the KKK had achieved its objectives of achieving white supremacy, and that now the white supremacy can be perpetuated lawfully without the use of violence. So that just adds to the context for that.
All right, so now that we have the historical context laid out for their original the construction of statues, I mean, what do they do now? What is the sort of the cultural, political work they're intending to do now, and sort of what's the point?
I mean, monuments are an expression of power, and they give a very singular view of a historical event. They're meant to consolidate the view, not to give complexity to a view. So the monuments continue in time and space to give a certain view of to consolidate white supremacy and to consolidate a reading of the Civil War in which the Confederacy's cause was noble. Whether or not we agree with that in contemporary culture is the question that's being asked of these monuments, I believe, justifiably.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I think it's also important for us, when we're thinking about the work that monuments do, to think about where they're placed, right? So if we take the example of Lafayette, which is the one we're most familiar with, the Mouton statue was in front of government, and then in 1980, when government moved to LCG, the Lafayette Consolidated Government, the intent was to move the statue with it. And so this is actually the second time Confederate monuments and their moving, if not removal, has been debated in Lafayette, right? In 1980, it was for something very different. The question was whether we preserve it and keep downtown a certain way, or we move it and we send a different message at Lafayette Consolidated Government. And in the end, the legal involvement of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it ended up remaining where it is today, kind of appropriately enough, at the intersection of Jefferson and Lee, downtown. And I think, you know, the fact that these monuments are in particular places is no accident. They're erected in places to send messages. It's not the case in Lafayette, thankfully, but you'll see many of them erected right beside courthouses, which sends another pretty clear message about the work that they intend to do.
Yeah, and think of it this way, monuments, you know, if it was on private property, it's just an expression of that individual, or even if it was on some organization's property, it's only an expression of that organization. But the fact that it's on publicly owned property, it's owned by the city, it's on public property, means that it's an expression of what our community says is that this is what represents our values, this is a person who we hold up, and you know, you have the expression, I put that person on a pedestal. Well, it comes from putting monuments up where you say, we're going to hold that person up as a model to our children. This is a person whose lives and whose values we want to emulate and copy and respect. And so that's the problem, is that it's not just a private expression, but it's a public expression of this is what our community stands for. And that's why a lot of people then have a very serious problem with it, because they say it's not what I stand for, and it's not, and I can speak personally, it's not, the Alfred Mouton statue does not represent myself or anyone I know. I have not spoken to one person, in person, in Lafayette, who says that that statue represents them or their values. The only people I see are online, people that claim it represents them.
And I wonder too, Weston, if I can just add, it's worth considering why neo-Nazis and fascists are rallying to defend these statues. If they represent white supremacy to someone, if the groups that purport to believe in white supremacy are rallying to defend them.
I wonder if you can elaborate a little more on that, because one of the points I made earlier was, you know, for some it's going to be seen as traitors to the state. For others, it's defenders of the state. So I wonder if you all can speak to that a little more, what groups are seek to uphold the monuments, and then those who seek to remove them. And then what happens in their removal? Where are they to go? And what does that mean that, for instance, they're removed from public space as a public expression? But then to what space do they go, and does that mean something different from what they're saying now?
Well, I think Maria got to an interesting point, which is the most common thing, or one of the most common defenses you hear from groups wanting to maintain the monuments as they are, is they don't matter that much, which again is kind of ridiculous if you see how people turn out to defend them in some places. You hear all these kind of things, which are very clearly false. And I think the magnitude of the defense of these makes very clear how important they are. And I think focusing on who's defending them, a list of people who have certainly a view that Alfred Mouton might have been a hero to Louisiana, despite historical reality. And I think groups that you might be even less likely to want to be associated with than that.
It's been suggested that the monuments might be removed and be placed in appropriate historical context in a museum or an archive of some sort, where the year it was erected, the context it was erected in, the celebrations that were held at the statue, the lynchings that were carried out near the statue, all of this context could be given with this, along with the statue, so that we could see it as a historical artifact of its time, not of the time it purports to represent.
Yeah, and there's context in which monuments are intended to be a part of history. In fact, maybe a lot of people aren't aware that Baton Rouge, for example, had a very tall monument of a generic Confederate soldier standing right in downtown Baton Rouge. And when they did sort of this re-landscaping of the downtown, they took down that Confederate statue, and this was a few years ago, before the whole current monument controversy came about. They moved it into the State Museum, which is the old state capitol, and it's there, it's in this room, it's got some plaques beside it that talk about the context of when this statue was erected. And they moved it to a museum, and there was no public controversy at the time. And so it's very easy to be done. And another example is battlefields, Civil War battlefields. I was just at Gettysburg over the summer, and there's monuments all around the battlefield, both to the Union and the Confederacy. But these monuments are all, it's really part of one big living history museum as you tour around and learn the history. It's not meant to glorify white supremacy or anything like that. These monuments are all part of talking about here's the location of this, this regiment, or this organization, this state, troops. And you might say, well, but didn't the state of Louisiana intend to honor and glorify its soldiers when they built the Louisiana State Memorial? Sure, but again, it's in the context where it's one big living history museum. And that's totally different from the context of a lot of these monuments.
And I would say that's a great example because, unless I'm wrong, I think national parks and places like Gettysburg have actually banned reenacting the Confederacy on their grounds. So they've actually drawn clear lines about what can be monuments we can consider historical and which ones we can see as glorification. And I think also it's important to talk about one of the other common criticisms that we get, which is that you're erasing history. And I think often the response to you're erasing history is no, we're just resituating history in a museum, but it's maybe a little more controversial, but I think you should embrace that you're erasing history and rewriting history. Because the history that you're erasing and rewriting is an incorrect history. It's one that's not based on historical reality, and it's a narrative that was reconstructed from the start in the 1920s, the 19-teens, as part of what historians call the lost cause, where the history of the Confederacy was rewritten from being about slavery to being a mythical defense of romanticized agricultural lifestyle. So to me, I think it's perfectly fine to be rewriting history if the history shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Well, yeah, and I think I want to be, because I think we need to be clear, the history, these Confederate monuments were already part of erasing history. It was part of that lost cause movement. Some of you, I recognize, were here in the earlier hour when I talked about that they were an attempt by Southern whites to literally erase a lot of their history and rewrite it with a completely fictional history. These monuments were part of that. So by moving the monuments to the museum, all you're doing is saying we're going to end fictional history and tell accurate, honest history. And also to dovetail with what you just said, one of the main arguments is, well, you're erasing history. Well, how is putting a statue in a museum where you're going to tell more history erasing history? You're not telling less history, you'll be telling more history than just a minimalist inscription on a base. So you could have an entire room this size with a few monuments and all kinds of plaques on the wall talking about the lost cause movement and all about the history of slavery and secession, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. That's telling way more history than a monument can do. So it's the opposite. It's not erasing history, it's telling history.
And I think one way to just re-put what Ian and Rick have so nicely said is that there's a real difference between history and cultural memory, or between history and memorialization. They're not the same thing. History is a discipline, a field of contestation, where we're noticing new patterns and where new evidence is unveiled and new arguments are being made. Memorializations, the intent of memorialization is to collapse complexity, to tell a singular narrative that privileges a singular point of view. It is not history. It's a representation of the historical moment, but it is not history itself, the field of history.
So to that point, glad you said, here's some comments I want to read from some famous tweets from President Trump. In the days that followed the events in Charlottesville. So on August 17th at 8:07 a.m., the president said, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." 8 minutes later, "You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish." 6 minutes later, "Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." So I wonder, is President Trump right that the removal of Confederate statues can lead to the removal of other statues like Washington, Jefferson, who represent certain parts of the American story, but not others?
Well, I would suggest that in the current moment, the opposition to statues of Lee, of Jackson, are fundamentally different from criticisms one might level at monuments to Jefferson or Washington. Because right now, most of the criticism of Confederate statues has been framed very much that way, that there's a push to take them down because they're statues to people who, as Dr. Hay would put, in one perspective, participated in a rebellion against the United States. People, and just as importantly as the Confederate nature of the monuments, they were erected during these Jim Crow and civil rights periods with the express purpose and intent of upholding white racial hierarchy. And I think the difference between that and statues to Washington and statues to Jefferson is less who they're a statue of and than what the purpose of the statue is, right? Most of the statues to Jefferson and to Washington are statues to their contributions to the nation as presidents rather than as slaveholders. The context of the Washington Monument is very different from the context of a Confederate statue on town squares across the South. So while there might be debates at some point, who knows, about monuments to slaveholders, I think right now there's a fundamental distinction between monuments that emphasize and are there for the purpose of memorializing them as Confederates, as white supremacists, as slaveholders, versus monuments to people who were slaveholders, but the statues memorialize a different aspect of their public life.
Yeah, you know, your question raised so many points that I could respond to. You know, if we say that we can never erect a monument to any flawed human being, then there could be no more monuments or statues ever, because we're all flawed. But you know, at some point you got to say, well, despite the person's flaws, we're still going to honor them for the positive things they did. And so I think there's a huge distinction between honoring Jefferson and Washington specifically for founding a nation, at least that, if not that it practiced liberty and equality perfectly, which it didn't, but at least establishing the concepts of liberty and equality. And we're not, those statues in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere don't honor them specifically saying Jefferson the great slave owner or Washington the great slave owner, whereas some monuments specifically are honoring people for their fight for the Confederacy, which specifically was, I mean, and I have two handouts, by the way, on a table, if you want to pick them up afterwards, all the quotes from Confederate leaders saying the Civil War was about slavery and they were fighting to keep people enslaved. So it's different than saying we're going to honor someone specifically for their fight for a government whose sole purpose they themselves said was to keep 4 million people enslaved. And so you have to make that distinction. And in fact, we did in, right at the start of the Revolutionary War, we tore down the statue of King George. You know, back when the City Council of Lafayette a year ago had a discussion about Alfred Mouton, one gentleman said it's un-American to tear down statues. Well, it was actually very American because we said, you know, King George doesn't represent us anymore, and we tore it down. And so if the public says the Confederacy doesn't represent us anymore, well, then we can tear that down.
I have two small points. The first point is I think there's a difference in the rhetorical and performative displays of white power that occur around Confederate statues versus statues of people like Washington and Jefferson. So part of the meaning of these statues have been their involvement in racial violence and the continuing sort of Confederate Jim Crow cause after the war was over. And so I think they've taken on a different valence of meaning than Jefferson and Washington. But my second point is about that first tweet, the Weston. Can you read it for us again one more time?
Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments.
Yeah, you'll notice he uses the word our twice. I'm a literary scholar. It's a possessive pronoun. It's a plural possessive pronoun. But what does he mean by our? And that indicates volumes, I think. That our doesn't include all Americans. It couldn't include all Americans because of what those monuments symbolize. And so it's exclusionary. You can already see the exclusionary logic in the defense. And in rhetorically positioning it as our monuments, he reinforces that exclusionary logic.
I want to say, that's interesting, Maria. I didn't pick up on the our history is only really a particular group's history. I focused on the ripped apart part. He says we're being ripped apart. But ironically, when I've seen groups either protest in favor of or against the Mouton statue downtown, the groups protesting in favor of the statue were very small and they were all white. But the groups protesting against it, because I've been there personally, it was very large and a very racially diverse group. So ironically, you have racially unified people against them, and so people are actually coming together across racial boundaries to oppose these statues. So it's ironically the opposite of what he says.
So I have a couple more questions. I want to go ahead and begin with opening it with Susan with the floor. But I do want to ask this last question before I do. Who do you think we become as a nation, as people, as a country, if the statues go? Arguably, it could also be if the statues stay. Depends on how you want to approach it.
Well, I think my first reaction had been expecting you to finish it with if they stay, right? But you had a different, probably better way of placing that. Because I was thinking when I was thinking about what we discussed in this panel, that really these monuments, you know, as much as we talk about them being about Jim Crow, about the 1920s when they were erected, this controversy is really about 2017, right? It's about what, as a nation, what as a state, as individual groups, people are willing to accept. And I think a positive way, perhaps, of looking at it if they go, is that a group of people who have been committed to defending the statues have accepted to something that they often publicly state shouldn't matter that much, but does matter to a group of people for whom the statues are a major problem, have been willing to concede something, to give up something that goes against their own perceived self-interest. On the other hand, if they stay, it sends a very different message, right? That a reluctance to look outwards, I guess.
Yeah, I think if the statues go, we've become a nation that is willing to grapple with and confront its history with open eyes. And if they stay, you know, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, we continue to live the lie, right? We continue to envelop ourselves in the dream.
Yeah, for me, the statues, as much as I think they should go, they're more of a symptom of a problem than the problem itself. They're a symptom of this underlying racial tension we've had throughout our history. And so, to me, once enough of the public reaches the critical mass where enough of the public says, you know, that's not us, that doesn't represent us, we want to come together racially, not be divided, that statue will just come down effortlessly. It won't even raise much media because people will say, well, of course that doesn't represent us. Of course that should be in a museum. Of course we need to tell this history accurately and honestly, not falsely as the Lost Cause did for the last 150 years. And so I think it's good that when you see in the communities around the nation where that's happening, that is what the communities are doing. They're saying, you know what, that just doesn't represent us anymore, and it's not causing a lot of controversy. And yes, this tends to be in northern or border states, or in New Orleans where you have a majority black population, but as that new mindset to say, let's come together racially, and let's say that doesn't represent us anymore, it'll permeate throughout the South, including cities like us. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I really believe that.
Well, I was going to say, I'm slightly similar but more pessimistic take, which is I agree that they're a symptom rather than the problem, but I would frame it slightly differently as perhaps it's hard to imagine more significant progress. Well, even this small thing can't happen. Whereas if they do come down, I still think there are a lot of barriers. It's slow going, but it's just kind of a particularly galling example that something that to many people seems so obvious and such a small thing to do is still not able to happen. And if that isn't able to happen, it's hard to see much change on so many other things.
Yeah, and I agree. I didn't mean to indicate that once these statues are gone, it's all peaches and roses. I'm just saying that will be a significant indicator though, that we've reached a critical mass where I think enough of the public is ready to start talking about the past and the present, honestly, and start to really grapple with these tough issues that, frankly, we still have not yet fully grappled with.
All right, so let's take some questions from the floor. Any thoughts?
I have a comment. Back in 2022, which means that the impetus for it was in 2021. A lot of black troops had fought in World War I, a fair number of them, and they came back in the South they were causing problems. This is a way of indirectly.
I can speak up a little bit.
If you
Hang on, do we have a microphone in between?
if you continue to treat blacks the way they are, we have it, there will be more problems. Because they already were rebelling in Texas, and I think some of the troops came back from Arkansas. I don't remember that much evidence a long time ago. But I know that a number of them did. Some of the states were, some of the communities were passing laws to inhibit civil disobedience by black soldiers returning and expecting to be beaten. They've been fighting over there for liberty and freedom. And they come back here and then they try to show them in boxes and whatever. And some of them were resisting that. They resented it. But I think that is part of the context of it. That was part of the reason why I think 22 is an important year. Because it's about 2 years after the war. The soldiers didn't all get back in 1919. Some didn't get back in 1920. But for a couple of years, this agreement with the way they were being treated, these soldiers who were fighting for liberty and freedom and so on, resented.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, monuments are a site of the contestation of rights, and the erection of a monument would have been the consolidation of white supremacy in public space, right? Doesn't matter whether you fought for this country, this space is white owned.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this phenomenon is as prevalent in Louisiana as other places. I've spent a lot of time in Georgia, but the whole Civil War reenactor movement, I'm wondering if there are any connections between that and KKK, white supremacist groups, and different studies of the motivations of these people who do that and what they get from that experience. I actually recently read an article critical of Renaissance fairs, which I saw people dressing up like medieval people. I remember where there were subcultures that were suspicious. But what's going on when people choose to engage with history that way? And is that different from erecting a monument? And what are the differences? Is there anything you can learn?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the correlation, but I think there is a difference in sort of putting yourself in an embodied experience. That's a reenactment, that's different than a monument. I think they still share the sort of mythic nostalgia that is dangerous. But I'd have to think more about what it means to put your body directly, to have that sort of embodied experience of the reenactment. It's a great question.
Yeah, there is a little bit of stuff on it, but I cannot remember the details well enough to feel comfortable summarizing it here. I mean, I know there is a coincidence, at least, with, in some cases, places setting up selling Nazi memorabilia in some cases with these. I don't know the prevalence of that. I'm kind of hazy on that. I do think there is also a slight difference in locations in terms of monuments are usually located very prominently, and the reenactments sometimes are not. Some of that is being banned from national parks, so not having a choice on it. But yeah, I have not worked through that fully, certainly.
In relation to the comment the gentleman made regarding white troops returning from World War I and having their eyes open to see what life is really like elsewhere out of this country, and resenting the treatment they received once returning home. In spite of that, it was not until after World War II that the service was actually integrated. So it took a Second World War experience of black people going away to see what life could really be. And going back to the beginning of your comments, you spoke of Jim Crow. I find that both black and white people have difficulty understanding what Jim Crow is. We hear the term, but don't quite get the meaning. And it should be clear that Jim Crow was a process of relegating black people to second-class citizenship. And the method used were laws enacted and placed in black code. Black people were made to feel inferior through the black codes and made to actually become black second-class citizens, thus enhancing what evolved into segregation of society.
I would just point out that there are terms that seem to be used interchangeably. That there is a difference between monuments and statues. Monuments is a broader term. And there are some difficult decisions that have to be made. For example, there's a coalition of civil rights groups at Princeton, and this is not a small group, that wants to remove all so-called monuments to Woodrow Wilson from the Princeton campus. How would you handle that situation?
So your question, I just want to make sure, is what is their response to the removal of statues?
To the demand that the removal of all monuments to Woodrow Wilson from the Princeton campus. You know Wilson's connection to Princeton, I said.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these questions have to be considered kind of holistically, right? Because we think of Woodrow Wilson as having this close connection to Princeton, where he served as president and came into politics in New Jersey. But we also think of Woodrow Wilson as
very, very racist.
Right. We also think of Woodrow Wilson as someone who
probably the most strongest racist of our post-Civil War presidents.
Absolutely. Ensures the civil service is white. Woodrow Wilson is good friends with Thomas Dixon, who wrote the book called The Klansman, who he knows from graduate school in Baltimore. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Dixon's book, The Klansman, you're probably more familiar with the movie it was turned into, Birth of a Nation, which coincides with the rise or renewal of the second KKK, and glorifies the initial Klan and its role in Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War. So I think Woodrow Wilson, as you said, it's easy to see Woodrow Wilson through this pretty unflattering light. And I think often it's a question of balancing interests, right? Like, what is the cost of removing a monument to Woodrow Wilson? In many ways, to me, it seems it's small relative to the impact that might have on people to whom that's upsetting. But, I mean, I know that's a question Princeton considered and chose not to remove references to Wilson. So, not a decision for me to make, I suppose.
That's what I was going to say. I think all these decisions should be made because I think each community needs to decide what their values are, what monuments or statues, however you define it, represents their values. And I don't think anyone should impose on communities, well, this is our values and you need to accept this. I think that, just like I wouldn't want somebody coming from outside of Lafayette saying, here's the statues you must have here. I think we should decide this on our own. I just hope that enough people would say that that statue doesn't represent our community's values. And since I live here, I have an opinion on that, but I'm not going to tell Princeton what statues they should have or not. But that's just my opinion.
Responding to your question about what the world looks like after the statue gets taken down, to what extent do you think that a focus on initial focus for this social organization that's calling for these statues to focus on these symbolic memorials, to what extent do you think that focus might distract from, or do you think that that focus might distract from more material, organizational, legal like structural racism problems. Do you think that people could go to a statue removal protest, get their activism therapy, the statue is taken down, and they say, that's the end of it, despite Dr. Watson's comment that this clearly is not the end of it? Do you think the social organization might, because of the way that the statute is framed, or because of the way that the movement is framed, end or disorganize at that moment?
I think that's a really fascinating question. I think the symbols themselves are really powerful, and I think we've seen social justice movements more generally in the last 10 years. I'm not a political scientist, you can speak to this question. Be really fighting over space. And I again just want to point out the ways in which these monuments mark space as white. So I think the symbols are fundamental to changing real material interests. And with the state of changing real material interests through legal channels right now, symbolic victories might be our only victories in the next few years.
I would add, though, too, I think it's a false choice to say, well, you can only care about a statue, but you can't care about poverty or housing or crime. I mean, people have the energy to be involved in multiple issues. And in fact, in my work just on the civil rights history I've been doing, I've been networking and met so many people that are involved in so many issues. So actually, I think it's a multiplicative effect that you bring people together for any issue, and then it creates a synergy, and you make connections, and then you learn about how you have common interests and goals. And so I think if anything, it enhances it, it doesn't detract from it.
Yeah, so we touched briefly on the statute of Baton Rouge being removed, kind of a less known fact. When did it become an issue of kind of the public opinion controversy? Do we remove it? Do we not remove it? And more of the, well, it's public, we're just going to take it down.
I think a simple answer, my panelists might offer more complex, thought out ones, is after Charleston, after the terrorist attack there, would be my, if you had to put a moment.
I would say after Obama.
That's enough.
And I think there are particular reasons why that is the case that we can all surmise.
And actually, I would say it was after the Confederate flag became controversial, after the shooting, when people began to say, okay, we finally are going to wake up to the fact of what these symbols represent, and maybe it's time to start saying we no longer are going to publicly value these symbols as representing what we as communities value.
And you're talking about the massacre of the Mother Mary Church, the shooting of 9 congregants at a Bible study at a historically black church in 2015. So just to give a little more context for Dylan Roof, who had the Confederate flag with him, promoted this, publicized it, and then decided to make his attack on that church, which he deliberately chose because of his own history, slave rebellions, to start, as he called, a race war. So that you're marking that point as sort of the jumping off point for these discussions about representation of Confederate symbols. Okay, so a couple more hands in the back. Go ahead, sir.
As I can appreciate the comments and the arguments made for and against the statute, I certainly can appreciate as a black man the removal of those statues for all the reasons that were stated. But I'm somewhat confused as a black man who can sit here and appreciate the words that have been used thus far to describe the argument to remove the statue. Here I am as a black man concerned about not so much about the removal of these statues, which history in itself speaks to the truth, as you have explained. However, I'm battling with the concept of what must I concern myself with as a black man in terms of the erection of modern day statues that reflects the same kind of historical racial connotation that is now. As a black man sitting in this auditorium, I'm looking at the fleur-de-lis, which is front and center, which has the same historical context for black people. The fleur-de-lis certainly is an African flower, but it was also used as a branding symbol, a racist symbol to brand black people. So why is it that we're sitting in a public institution holding the conversations that we're having now about irrelevant, racist statues that should not be, and we're sitting in a university with the fleur-de-lis front and center as its symbol of success, as its symbol of fairness and inclusiveness, when we know that historically it is not?
I think that's a great question.
I'm going to disagree a little bit. You know, in my own research of the local history, you're right that in French Louisiana, the French Le Code Noir, the Black Code, the slave code, did require that if you tried to escape, your first attempt to escape, you were branded with the fleur-de-lis. But the fleur-de-lis goes back centuries before that, and has been used for centuries since then in many numerous contexts. It just happened to be a symbol that was co-opted simply for that purpose, but I don't think that the fleur-de-lis is inherently a racist symbol. But I do appreciate your point that it was used in that horrible context.
I think it also comes down to a question of what's the barrier for getting this debate started, right? I think the barrier for getting a debate started over a Confederate statue to a slave owner is lower than the barrier to getting an accepted debate about the meaning of a colonial symbol, in which you're mentioning it in the context of a brand that was used on slaves, but in many ways it's really a debate over the French colonial legacy, their role in slavery here, and so on. And I think have a much harder time getting a debate going, calling all that into question and getting support for it. And I think in practical terms, that might be why we're here debating one rather than the other.
In fact, let me just follow up on this. I think that there's a difference between a symbol whose design was intended to be a racist symbol versus something that was innocently designed that just happened to have that some person or group decided to use it for a racist reason. And so that's why, to me, the Confederate flag is totally different than the fleur-de-lis. The Confederate flag was specifically designed as a symbol of a government that proclaimed white supremacy and that was founded as a white supremacy. Fleur-de-lis was founded in entirely a non-racial context that happened to have one of its numerous uses be used in a racist manner, but that doesn't mean the symbol itself was intended to be racist or represents racism.
I think I might push back a little bit, though, on the intent idea. To me, the distinction is not how it's created, but like how it's known and used and what people see when they view it, right? To me, the intent of the creator matters a bit less than what it means to people who experience it now.
May I follow up? Just based on what we said.
Just a second.
I think,
sir, if you'll permit me on the other side, we'll come back. Yeah. But if you can hold your point.
Yeah, I'd like to make a related point. I detect a little bit of inconsistency in this discussion of what symbols mean, because we've had this really interesting informative panel about certain statues and monuments and symbols that mean racism and therefore must come down. And then in response to a very interesting question, and I didn't know the history behind that, so I thought the question was very interesting. The answer is, well, symbols can mean different things to different people. And if the fleur-de-lis means lots of different things to lots of different people, then I see no reason why the stars and bars, or why a particular statue or a particular monument can't also mean different things to different people. So who, by the way, political scientist folks, so I'm thinking kind of politically, who has the authority to say, this is what the symbol means, and on the basis of what I say the symbol means, it either stays or it goes? That's the political question. Who gets to decide what the symbol means?
Well, actually, I always go by what the people who design the system say it means. I just take their words for it. That's it. So
I agree with Dr. Beamish.
I mean,
Dr. Beamish, come to my
well,
rescue.
I think there's a mixture. I think it's a complex calculus. You have to look at partly what the symbols were designed for, and partly how they've come to be used. I don't think you can exclude either element. And for me, I put a lot of weight on what people say the symbols were designed for, because if they were designed for that use, then they were also typically used for that use. And that's again why I don't think it's inconsistent to say the Confederate flag was designed as a symbol. In fact, the guy who designed the Confederate flag specifically said, I can show you the newspaper articles where he said this is a symbol of the superiority of the white race.
Rick, I didn't know you were a religious on this.
Huh?
I
Yeah.
know you were original.
Yes, I'm
The
an
US
original.
Constitution was designed to empower white male property owners, but that doesn't mean we all have to understand that the Constitution stands for the power of white male property owners. We can have different interpretations. So the question is, who gets to denominate the authoritative interpretation on the basis of which the monument stays or goes?
Well, I think one thing we're discussing is how the symbols are being used in public spaces, right? The Confederate statues and Confederate flags are put out there with specific intents when they're put up, and they've been continued to be used in that same way. And I would argue a lot of people who would advance an interpretation of the Confederate flag might not be consistent in their own ideas with what they say publicly. I think most people would probably in a public venue be more able to come to an agreement on what the Confederate flag is than on something like the fleur-de-lis, where if you ask most people in this room, much less across the country, the number of people who understand the fleur-de-lis as having been a brand in slavery might be significantly lower.
I'm actually not sure that with regard to Confederate monuments, there's a disagreement as to what they represent. They represent the Confederacy. The disagreement is over whether or not the Confederacy is a positive good or a negative.
I was thinking of the saying heritage, not hate.
Right, but so there's an interpretation of heritage that excludes a belief in slavery and a willingness to die on behalf of slavery, of protecting slavery. But that is a willful ignorance of historical truth, right? So I don't know where that lands on the question.
Okay, so if you'll hold your point so we can get to the other hands, and then we'll come back around once we have a little more time. Go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of a symbol and its origins and having to know what the origins were, the original intent was. Oh, yeah, in terms of a symbol and its origins, knowing what its origins are, and that sort of carries through. The classic example of that problem would be the swastika, right? Which dates back thousands of years and had various meanings. But of course, none of that really matters anymore, and no one would really argue that we can talk about what it might mean or it means to different people because of its recent history. So, it really is about the time and the context and the use of it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Kind of backtracking just a little bit, but one of the panelists said it. I wanted to agree. They talked about space and the use of sort of how Confederate monuments are using space from monuments. And I like that. I think you need to expand it, right? Because it's not just monuments we're talking about in a lot of senses. We're also talking about names for buildings, for, parishes here in Louisiana. In the 19-teens, you have 3 parishes created in the southwestern part of the state after Jefferson Davis, P.G.T. Beauregard, and the Louisiana governor, Confederate governor, Governor Allen, right? So it's not just the monuments, it's also how this whole ideology has been transposed onto space itself, right? The question that I want to ask is actually a little different. I just wanted to throw that in. But one of the things that I always hear, right, and you see it on the internet a lot, is this notion that racism and this veneration for the Confederacy, it's an old thing. Previous generations have it, but as those generations die off, it's going to go away. And new generations embrace something different, right? But if you look at some of the pictures that came out of Charlottesville, for instance, there's a lot of young people in those crowds, and a lot of young people there supporting it, right? So my question is, in addition to taking away these, or to getting rid of these, what I think are bad history, right? Shouldn't we also be focusing on changing and working on changing how people are taught history, right? In schools and the ways that how kids in high schools and middle schools are getting bad history and getting wrong history.
Yeah. I'm sure many people in this room are familiar, or at least have heard about debates over high school history textbooks, right? I mean, I think one example I often use, I don't know if it's still the case, but 3 or 4 years ago at least it was the case, that on the US citizenship test, the 2 correct answers for what the Civil War was about are slavery and states' rights. Like, you can see this all over the place, and yeah, absolutely, education has to be a central part, and there's been some progress, and there's a long way to go still with that.
And just to comment on your first comment, what I think is so interesting is the ways in which those names have also infiltrated military bases. I taught at West Point last year, and there's the Lee Housing Unit and Lee Barracks, and right, it's in New York, right? West Point is in New York State. But the ways in which that history has been affiliated with the US military is also a thing we have to consider, I think, and be suspicious of.
To answer your question, who gets to decide? The Lafayette Consolidated Government will decide if that monument is removed. It takes 5 votes, and the only way we get to 5 votes is if constituents of Lafayette Parish get to a mindset that they believe that that monument represents something that's bad, and then they influence their governmental officials, i.e. the Parish Council, to at least get 5 votes. If you can't count to 5, the monument will not be removed.
There you go.
I want to take the question back to Thomas Jefferson, not to follow the thought of President Trump, but from a slightly different angle. I think, well, I was thinking after reading a very fascinating article about a man named Derek Black, who was actually a leading figure amongst white nationalists, and then he actually changed after going to college. After studying history, actually, he changed his mind. But anyways, one of the things that this gentleman pointed out was Jefferson actually is an inspiring figure to people who identify themselves as white nationalists. So white nationalists demarcate themselves from white supremacists. They believe that they're not upholding slavery, they're not backward in that sense, but they believe that the United States of America was founded as a white nation, and that's its destination, you know. And for them, people like Jefferson is inspiring for an obvious reason, because he's one of the major founding fathers, and not just because he was a slaveholder, but because some of these people are history buffs, and they find out what Thomas Jefferson wrote in his Notes of Virginia and his private letters, and also especially how much Jefferson was such a proponent of keeping America white by separating white people from free blacks. You know, it's not just a matter of slavery, of course. So, I mean, these are questions which, following some of the points that you made earlier, some of the people in the panel made earlier, well, if the question is how the majority of Americans remember certain historical figures and how we remember that, if that's one of the criteria about whether we put down these monuments or try to set up different monuments, well, I think we have to kind of think about, is there a certain point at which we have to decide that remembering Jefferson, celebrating him is more negative to our public memory or positive? Because, yeah, we can argue that, of course, his contributions to his founding of the nation and Constitution, the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, as long as the majority of Americans only focus on that, I guess we can say that it's fine. But what about the people who are finding out more and more about the dark side of Jefferson and people who actually are inspired by that, like white nationalists? So is there a certain line that at some point we have to make that decision that now this is a more negative influence? And is that solely by our kind of gauging a sense of what the public understands about these historical figures?
Yeah, I would say it's questionable intellectually whether there's a line. I think the line is more a pragmatic line right now in terms of identifying Confederate monuments as the pressing issue. But I think what you bring up about Jefferson suggests that it is kind of a false distinction, right, to talk about public and private lives. Because as you point out, Jefferson's public life involves the Louisiana Purchase, right, which he sees as an empire for liberty. only for white families, right? He wants to create a Republican white region. He believes there's going to be a race war if slavery ends, right? Jefferson has all sorts of these ideas. And I think it's a fair question to ask about Jefferson. I would say it's a slightly different question than is being asked about the Confederate statues, or maybe a slightly different version of the same question. Because there we are asking a question of, I think, about the history of the United States as a slaveholding republic versus the strain of white supremacy that's coming right now, being directly connected to the Civil War. You can argue certainly whether those things are actually distinct or not, but I think that's kind of where it stands.
I have a hard time seeing an end to people's undying belief in liberal democracy. To imagine that moment, maybe it will arrive, but I think the sort of promises of liberal democracy will have to be revealed to be false to a lot of people that right now have an undying belief in them in order for that moment to arrive. Maybe it will. It feels like we're hastening on towards the apocalypse every day.
And I would say this is a question that would have been great to actually come up earlier, right? Because it ties us more clearly than some of the previous ones did to Constitution Day.
Right.
And we could do a whole section on how the Constitution itself plays into this.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to add though, because I have beliefs about, or opinions about this. And I made this point earlier, if we say that a person is a flawed human being, means that we cannot make a statue or monument to them, then we have to eliminate all statues and all monuments. Because even the leaders like Lincoln and Martin Luther King had personal flaws in their lives, and we can say that those aspects of their lives should not be modeled. But we say that on balance, they were such great human beings, they accomplished so much good, that it outweighs any negative things or immoral things they did in their personal lives, that we still think that on balance, these are, we gotta have some heroes in our life. We gotta have some heroes, white and black, to say these are people who we can aspire to and lead us, or there's just no hope. I think there's just no hope to say that there's any hope for humanity or for leadership or for greatness. And so maybe I'm optimistic, maybe I'm naively optimistic, but I think we can say that on balance, we can, every individual we have to say, did they do more on good on balance, or do more good on balance than bad? And if so, let's reward them for that. Let's honor them for that. And just because they did some maybe very flawed things in their life doesn't necessarily disqualify them from us saying that's somebody who we should respect.
Well, I would say, if we need heroes, I think Jefferson is not the hero we need. He might be the one we deserve, but...
You said before, the point was like after the monuments are moved out, like removed or whatever, that it can open up a conversation about our problems with race in this country. But wouldn't it open us up to more like white backlash and white rage, like you said? Is it going to be more good, or is it going to bring out the worst in people as we see now?
I think that's a totally valid question. And it's hard to know what the breaking point will be, right? If it can only ever get worse and it will never get better, or if it has to get worse before it gets better, I think is what your question begs. But I think there is something to the struggle, even if the outcome isn't the outcome we want.
Yeah, if you look at the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of turmoil. So there was a lot of backlash. Obviously, there's a lot of violent backlash by whites to the civil rights movement. But we made it through that to reach a better place. And so, yeah, I think you're already seeing some backlash, like what happened in Charlottesville. But the choice is to say, we're just going to keep the status quo and never move forward. And we'll just be quiet and silent about all these racial issues and tensions and poverty and everything else, and we're just going to not say anything. Or we're going to say, we need to talk about this, we need to move forward, and if there's a backlash, so be it, but we'll work through that, we'll push through that so that we can make forward progress. I mean, that to me is the choice.
So for what has been a very engaging discussion, we have to let that be the last question. But I want to thank everyone for coming. Please keep in mind too that Dr. Swanson has a couple of handouts that you might want to pick up to continue the conversation. And thank you again for coming.